How's it going, everyone? This is International Master Daniel Rensch. This is Chess.com, and this is the day we get back on track on our road toward the mastery of every pawn structure known to man. That's right, Pawn Structure 101 is back. And we're actually back with kind of a special video today, sort of a halftime report, if you will. Obviously, the last structure covered by my partner, International Master David Pruis, was the E5 chain, and you can see those videos here if you look at the related links in the lower right corner here of the page you're viewing. And of course, I spent a lot of time covering Yaroslav structures and many other specific types of pawn structures. But today's video is something a little bit different because I realized it was just as needed in this Pawn Structure 101 series as covering new structures. This video here, which is essentially designed to help you see which pawn structures will be reached from all of the mainline openings in chess. That's right. We have about 40 openings we are going to cover in today's video. So kind of something that will also complement a recently released video by Grandmaster Gregory Kaidanov, which was on the subject of how to develop an opening repertoire. There's also been a few videos recently by David Pruis called Every First Move, which were for very beginner, like literally just players who are just starting out and want to kind of know the definition and purpose behind every single possible first move. So a little bit extreme in that, covering every single possible first move as well as all the possible defenses for black against e4 and d4. But this one is going to talk about all the mainline openings, so tournament chess, and the pawn structures that are reached from those mainline openings. So some of it will be slight review from structures that we've already covered specifically within this series, which you can scroll around and find. But as sort of a general outline, as I said, kind of a halftime report, we're going to take this moment to let everybody get excited about all the pawn structures that are possible within their openings, and so that nothing is really missed. I don't claim that I won't forget a couple things, and we'll keep the comments thread to this video active, trying to place any descriptions about things I might forget, but I spent a lot of time preparing this video, made a list of all the relevant I felt openings that needed to be covered, and I hope you enjoy it. So we're going to go through openings here, and we're going to show the first, let's say, 5 to 10 moves of each one, and then talk about the pawn structure therein and the possibilities that could take place from that pawn structure. The X, Y, and Z plans for white and the A, B, and C plans for black, essentially saying, here's a structure that can be reached from this opening. This is essentially what can happen. That's it. Next song, next pawn structure, let's move on. We're going to keep it snappy. We're going to keep it quick, as usual. You know that when I'm rocking the video mic here on Chess.com, it's going to be a bumpy ride. And buckle up, buttercups. Let's do this. So, starting with openings that can occur from 1e4, we have to start first with the mainline Ruy Lopez. Now, after bishop b5 is played, again, this is what we would consider a Ruy Lopez, there are essentially a couple mainline structures that can be reached. After the move a6 is played, one structure that's possible is, of course, in the exchange variation, where eventually these pawns, the E and D pawns, will be traded for each other. After something like d4, essentially we might point out, though these are not necessarily the best theoretical moves these days, that we have a 4-on-3 endgame structure with white possessing a positional material advantage. In the middle game types of these positions of this structure, black typically has a dynamic advantage, that being the bishop pair and quick access to the open center diagonals and files. The other thing that can happen, the other move order that can be played that is possibly reaching the same type of structure is the Berlin. The Berlin defense for black involves knight f6, followed by capturing on e4 immediately, though at first it doesn't seem that we're reaching the same structure. After the mainline moves of d4, knight to d6, bishop takes c6, d takes c6, d takes e5, Eventually we reach this position, considered the main line of the Berlin defense, one of the most popular weapons for black against the Ruy Lopez these days, and we see essentially the same structure, with white possessing a 4-on-3 positional majority advantage, and black possessing the bishop pair and open lines as a dynamic compensation. Back to the main line, Ruy Lopez. After a6, we can also see the complex structure, which was covered in the first video of this series. I call it the King's Indian or Spanish complex, can be reached via the main line. And in this type of structure, after c3, d6, h3, main line, we have this position here, which is essentially slightly more in depth in the intro complex video in this Pawn Structure 101 series. You can check out that video. But for here, all we'll say is that here's the main options that can happen. At some point, obviously, white has the option of capturing, which will leave us with an open D file. So if white was in a position to quickly control the access of that file, white might consider doing so. Though because black is normally the one in better position for that, you don't see white usually capture. Normally what white recognizes here in this structure is that D5 and F5 are potential holds for the knight, which is why you see many mainline Ruy Lopez / Spanish game plans consist of the knight relocating itself to gain access into these squares. Making sense, right? You're seeing how developing moves are affected by the structure. The other option that can happen, of course, besides maintaining it or taking it for white, is of course to push the pawn. The advantage of doing so will be that a closed center allows you normally to get better attacking chances on one particular side of the board. For white, that is normally the king side. Let's say after a knight relocates, maybe even a pawn storm. However, you don't normally see white close the center too quickly because black will also, therefore, have an uninhibited queenside attack, which in this case is a little bit further advanced than white's. So 3 main options for white. You can take, you can push, and you can leave it. For black, we essentially have the same thing. He could take it at some point, trying to trade everything. The obvious disadvantage of doing so if you do it right away is that you'll be left strapped with this isolated d6 pawn. For black to break the tension, or let's say leave the tension, he could try to advance this pawn, though again, normally unless black is immediately getting great queenside counterplay or playing c4 after white's d5, you don't see black relieve the tension there very often. And of course, black can also build up, hoping for white to capture e5 and thus open the d file. So the complex, KID complex structure here is one that's very useful to be aware of. The last note I'd like to add, again, you can reverse this structure and get it in many King's Indians. That's the last note I'd like to add when something like this happens, especially in, let's say, G3 King's Indians, which are not as popular as just mainline bayonet King's Indians, but after this move order here, we see that this structure can be reached. Very similar, though it is being seen from the opposite side with a complex of tension here and neither side really wanting to take right away. Back in that Spanish complex, the last real point that you should be aware of, if I can quickly set up that position again, is that the outpost square that we pointed out, that being the D5 outpost square, is not the only one. This square is not the only potential weakness. The other option for black behind playing c4, especially if the d file has become open, is to take advantage of this weak square. Not the most obvious outpost square, but for example, if white was to play a little bit lazy here, capturing, allowing control over the d file to slip to black, one very common plan is to extend the c4 pawn, followed by a relocation of the knight into this square, and black is happy. So the mainline Spanish has been covered. The next mainline pawn structure that can occur from the Ruy Lopez is the Marshall attack, which essentially can be avoided with the move h3 rather than playing c3 immediately. If you're from white's perspective these days, the modern theory suggests that white can play h3, and he's not losing the bishop pair on a move like this because the e5 pawn is still hanging. So after black plays d6, now white can play c3. The reason for that is that the Marshall attack, which is d5 in this position rather than d6 as the main line we just discussed, is designed to open the center and sacrifice the e5 pawn in order to try to quickly take advantage of white's king side, before white is able to complete the development on this side of the board. Not necessarily a pawn structure to talk about, but open center positions also deserve our attention in regards to pawn structure, not just positions where there's obvious pawn tension or pawn weaknesses or pawn chains. Open center positions, often tactical, more romantic style chess, which was much more popular, I guess, maybe 100 years ago or something. These positions were played a lot more often. Is certainly worth our attention and is part of the pawn structure, that being that black sacrifices that pawn in order to take advantage of white's development. So once again, it's a dynamic game, and if white wants to avoid the martial attack, white can quickly play the move h3 here, because once again, now d5 doesn't make as much sense, due to the fact that after capturing with the rook in c6, unlike the position before where the pawn was taking away the natural square from the knight, white can simply develop this knight, quickly catching up with black, and black is unable to justify the pawn sacrifice fully. The next mainline structure that can be reached through e4 openings that we're going to discuss here can be reached via the Scotch as well as Giocco piano type of openings. That is when white challenges the center quickly with a move like d4. Similar to a Ruy Lopez, we see white with this 4-on-3 in the middle game. However, unlike a Ruy Lopez, it is not as clear of a positional advantage in the endgame because black still has control over the e-file here, having not taken on c6 yet. Though one thing to note about a 4-on-3 structure, white's main idea in the Scotch is that a 4-on-3 is a much more mobile attacking structure in the middle game, whereas a 3-on-2 advantage is not necessarily being executed until the endgame with less pieces on the board. That's because in many of these positions, white can actually castle and slide the king over to h1 where it still receives 2-pawn protection, allowing these pawns to be mobile and attack. So remember that, kids. A 4-on-3 is a much more mobile attacking structure in the middle game. That's something that can happen in these Scotches. And after something like bishop to c5, which is the classical, one of the main lines of the classical goes knight takes c6, queen to f6, threatening the intermezzo of checkmate. White defends, and after d takes c6, we actually have that exact same structure from the Ruy Lopez with the 4-on-3 belonging to white. And though black does not necessarily have the bishop pair clear here, as white also still has 2 bishops, black's development lead is a little bit more so here than it is in a mainline Ruy Lopez. So that's the advantage that black typically finds in the classical Scotch. The Mises Scotch is another opening, and after knight takes c6, b takes c6, we see a slightly different type of structure here, with black having a much worse positional queenside, but a lead in development usually to compensate forward, with the main lines of this opening reaching moves such as this, where white, as you see, has made a lot of pawn moves and 1 queen move without any other developing moves. However, white has a potential space advantage in these structures, and if he does catch up in development, black is positionally much worse due to the structure. Moving on, we review the structure that has already been talked about in the E5 Chains addition to this Pawn Structure 101 series by David Pruss, that being the French. In the E5 chains, the basic structure tells us that white has space potentially toward the king side, and whenever you have a pawn on E5, that's kind of a suggestive to be attacking on the king side. For those who understand pawn structure, white will often develop the pieces in order to create potential for that attack to be successful on the king side, with black, on the other hand, using the queen side and space on this side of the board as a means to put pressure both on the queen side and on the center itself, with the queen and knight developing very quickly to b6 and c6. The exchange French is another opening here, another option for white. Here we have a symmetrical structure. Though these positions are not as dynamic tactically, and perhaps as exciting for players who want different types of counterplay for both sides, here we have a basic fight with a completely symmetrical structure over the one critical open file, which is the E file, though oftentimes if white wants to mix it up, he can also follow with C4, which may potentially create an isolated queen pawn. There are many videos on this site about this structure, including my own series, which has its own dynamic potential, with both white wanting to be aggressive whenever you have an isolated pawn and black wanting to target the isolated pawn and usually trade off minor pieces to eliminate white's more active minor pieces. So the French has the potential to reach an advanced type of chain structure in many of the main lines, including the advance itself, the winnower, which essentially is the exact same structure you just saw in the advance, with the major difference being this bishop is gone for this knight. White's queen side is even worse. However, black's king side is also under much more potential threat, because without the dark square bishop, white's attack is potentially devastating in main lines. Essentially, the dynamics of playing the pawn chain, though, with black wanting to attack on the queen side and white wanting to go with the king side, remain in the winnower, and they would also remain in the main lines of the Tarrasch defense, or the Tarrasch approach to the French, with structures like this being possible. Different move orders about it taking place at the highest levels of chess, but essentially you see positions like this reached on a regular basis. Again, this is the Tarrasch, and white has this pawn chain suggesting potentially dangerous attacking chances on the king side, with black having a slight lead in development and using the queen side to put pressure against white's center. Again, back to the main line positions of the French. We have covered the exchange variation, the winnower, and the Tarrasch, with being all the main structures that can be reached through this opening. The other mainline pawn structure that can be reached through both the Caro-Kann, which is the opening we're looking at now, and the French, our last opening, we should certainly do justice to it, after both knight c3 and knight to d2 possibilities, is a Caroslav structure. Now, this particularly being the Caro family of the Caroslav structure. More than any other structure, this has been covered in depth within this video series, so we strongly suggest you go and check that out. Essentially, this structure suggests that black wants to play for the moves c5 and e5, as without those moves, white would be playing with a significant space advantage in every Caroslav structure, potentially leading to much better pieces. More space potentially leads to better pieces, which is essentially the sole purpose of building strength within your position by gaining space. I know I'm talking very fast here, but that's because we have a lot of ground to cover, and I want everyone to be able to watch this video a few times if they need to. We want to keep the tempo moving so that we're fulfilling our promise within this video, which is we are covering every structure you need to know within all the mainline openings. So that structure can be reached via the French, as you see here, as well as within the classical Caro-Kann, like so. Essentially, the only difference being the c-pawn being advanced instead of the e-pawn, whereas in the French we had the opposite position. However, black wanting to play for c5 and e5, as well as use the d-file to put pressure on d4 is critical. White wants to essentially prevent the moves e5 and c5 to the best of his ability, use his space advantage to gain better pieces and more control over the center, and eventually prepare hopefully for a d5 advance if you're white. Again, that covers two lines of the French and the Caro-Kann. Within the Caro-Kann, we can also have an advanced variation, which is essentially a very similar structure to what we talked about in the advanced French, with both sides potentially having clear plans, white wanting to attack via the king side, and black wanting to attack via the queen side. The other possible structure, of course, within a Caro-Kann is if white captures here, white can capture and maintain this orthodox structure, which is actually the reversed structure, if you look at it right here, that you can see within a Queen's Gambit decline. So we are covering another mainline opening. The Queen's Gambit decline, which often, eventually, we see a capture on this critical tension point of d5. In doing so, we see this sort of structure here reached, with white playing for the minority attack. Again, there are videos on this subject. Please check them out within this series. And black playing within his structure to attack via the king side. In the Caro-Kann, Roman Dzindzichashvili has a few videos discussing what to do in this main line. I actually played this myself against Irina Krush last year. There's a video on the site, again, covered by Roman Dzindzichashvili. And we essentially have a reversed structure here of that QGD minority attack, with black wanting to play for the minority attack and white wanting to attack via the king side. Finally, within the Caro-Kann, we can also see the Panov-Botvinnik, which is a capture on d5, and instead of avoiding it with moves like bishop d3 that we just discussed, we see white play aggressively for c4, and whenever we inevitably see a capture here on d5, as in this main line here, we have reached an IQP structure. We have a 10-part video series with even a bonus video discussing this pawn structure as one of the most dynamic and interesting structures every chess player needs to know. You can check those out. They're within my video library. Finally, one of the other main big daddies within the E4 is, of course, the Sicilians. Essentially, when you face a Sicilian, you have two major differences in terms of how the pawn structure can go. That being the open and the closed Sicilian. We are not discussing every line of the Sicilian, but when we get into the Sicilian specifics of this Pawn Structure 101 series, each one of them will be receiving their own video, of course. For now, what you need to understand is that there are two main philosophies, essentially. White can avoid playing d4 and therefore challenge black's center, or white can play d4. From black's perspective, the philosophy of the Sicilian that most people overlook is that he wishes to control critical squares in the center without actually needing to use these central pawns. If white allows him to do so with the closed Sicilian, which is one of the first options, essentially not playing for d4 and allowing this control to be increased, if white is going to allow that kind of control for black, white needs to get compensation for it by launching an attack on this side of the board. For example, we see moves like this within the Grand Prix attack, and what we have is a position where white has not challenged black's control in the center, but essentially instead has created a pawn chain conducive of creating a kingside attack. I bet you didn't know that was the whole idea if you're not going to play an open Sicilian. Many players make the mistake of not playing an open Sicilian, but also blocking their f-pawn. So after moves like this are played, and white doesn't play for d4, we have a position where black has been able to control critical dark squares in the center, at the same time leaving his center pawns to eventually challenge the light squares in the center. This would be a position that is already at least equal for black, and I would evaluate as dynamically better for black as the position develops, with black having the ability to not only create control of the light squares, but also the dark squares, and use it as a launching pad for attacking on the queen side. In order to have this structure where you have not challenged the center if you're white, the only way you can justify a close Sicilian is the way that Roman Djindjiashvili has recommended in some of his videos. There are also some videos by Charles Galofre talking about the potential of a Grand Prix attack. That being, white has to have this f4 advance, which creates this natural attacking chances on the king side, as the only way to justify not challenging black's center. Back to challenging black's center, we would be in an open Sicilian, where regardless of black's move on move 2, whether it be knight to c6 or d6, white is playing d4, and in doing so, white has said no to black's ambitions of controlling the dark squares in the center and using these pawns for light square control. But in doing so, white has also given up a central pawn for a wing pawn, essentially a positional disadvantage. So in a position like this, what you see is white has a pawn that is further advanced. However, black has two central pawns versus white's lone central pawn, essentially allowing the Sicilian to be a very dynamic opening. One of the reasons why it's very popular at the highest levels. So again, the major philosophies being to play an open Sicilian or a closed Sicilian. In order to justify a closed Sicilian, you must be ready to try to develop a kingside attack if you'd like to play that pawn structure. The only other ways to play open Sicilians are with gambits, but essentially it's the same principle as what I just said about an open Sicilian in terms of challenging black's ambitions there of controlling the dark squares, though in this case white has simply sacrificed a pawn, this being the Smith-Morra Gambit, the final option being an Alapin Sicilian, which has the intentions of getting d4, challenging black's plans, but not leaving black with two center pawns versus one. Instead, white intends to take back with the pawn and having two center pawns versus two. This would be a type of position that would offer white a significant advantage with pawns that are so much further advanced than black's. However, the disadvantage of c3 is that it blocks the development of this knight, thus allowing black to immediately challenge the center and leave white potentially behind in development in this way, or with the move d5, essentially bringing out the queen early, normally a risky proposition, but in this case a little bit more playable because white cannot attack the queen, immediately forcing the first lady back to her starting square. With that said, let's move on from the Sicilian to the other main line opening against d4, which is the Scandinavian. And in this case, we actually see black allow white this tempo. However, what's interesting to note about the Scandinavian is that you are in a pawn structure we already discussed. Can you guess it? Ding, ding, ding. That's the Yaroslav. Though the knight is blocking the c-pawn, you are actually in the same Yaroslav family here. So what black is essentially saying is, I'm going to lose time with my queen, allowing your pony to develop with a tempo. However, in exchange for this, you now are in a Yaroslav where I'm still going to be playing for e5 and c5 potentially as black, yet you don't have potential to really get your full space advantage. You would really like to have this same position with the knight behind the c-pawn on c4, not in front of it. Now, with that said, most of the mainline theory will lead to a slight advantage for white as long as white simply learns it in the Scandinavian, but the pawn structure you can reach is a Yaroslav. The Alekhine defense can reach original positions as far as an extended center with dynamic potential, both sides having tension on the center, and this knight being developed so early. So in some cases, if the tension really remained, you would see a very sort of original structure, as in a four pawns attack, not something that falls under the mainline categories of pawn structures and plans that we see transposed from other openings. However, though these positions are original and dynamic, and of course you can learn the theory, White obviously wants to be aggressive. Black has lost time, though in this type of position, to show once again the risk for White is that he has moved so many pawns, he's potentially very weak. Not only in the king, but whenever you gain space so quickly, if you're not able to maintain it, space can eventually become weak squares. But the other mainline structure that can be reached besides an original one, such as the four pawns, via the Al-Johans defense, which is actually the correct Russian pronunciation, is actually a Yaroslav. In a lot of main lines these days, we see this capture take place on e5, and in this case, though it looks dynamic with the knights being funnily placed so early, you are actually immediately in a Yaroslav structure. Most people don't know that many Al-Johans defense reach a Yaroslav structure. The other option, of course, sometimes you see this sort of symmetrical structure, which might be similar to like an exchange French, though it is the opposite with the d-file. We are dealing with a position with one open file, therefore the play will be dictate around who really gets control over this open d-file. Woo, we did it. That's e4, everybody. Guess what? Time for d4 mainline openings. So, the main lines that can be reached via Queen's Gambits, such as the standard Queen's Gambit, even the exchange variation, eventually with this pawn being given back. Again, that's not mainline theory. But just to point out that the main structure that is reached via the Slav, the QGD, and many other mainline Queen's Gambits is something we've already discussed, that being a Yaroslav. Eventually seeing a position with the 2 versus this key D pawn, though this would be the Slav version of a Yaroslav, with rather than the E pawn being missing and this pawn being over here on C2, as we just discussed in the Scandinavian, here we see it being the E file pawn. Essentially, the principles are the same in these types of structures, with Black wanting to play for E5 and C5, as well as use the D file for pressure. But White, having the E pawn, sometimes has a little bit more ambitious intentions on the king side, because if White is able to achieve a center advantage without any good play by Black, which you will eventually see here is an extension of E5, followed by potential attacking chances, once we've created that pawn chain that we saw similarly in the French and the advanced Caro-Kann. But again, as this is not just pawn structure, this is an opening theory lecture. So discuss the opening theory. Here we see a mainline Slav with d takes c4, White playing a4 in order to prevent b5. In the main line, we see bishop f5, using that extra time that White took to stop b5 in order for Black to prevent e4. Black is using the extra time for that. And after the move knight to e5, Black has two main moves, being e6 and knight b to d7. With the move e6, eventually we see very dynamic and original positions. Though it is potentially a Yaroslav, this would not necessarily fall under any mainline structure, as normally once Black allows this huge center, he immediately follows it up with a piece sacrifice, as we've seen in many mainline Grandmaster games, including a recent game I analyzed between Grandmaster Georgi Khachashvili and now newly minted Grandmaster Sam Shanklin. You can see that video. It was the bonus video in the Unbalanced Material series. So that's one mainline theory of the Slav, where Black has to be aggressive in order to not allow White to grab this central pawn advantage. The QGD move orders that don't involve d takes c4, and reach a Yaroslav will often simply reach positions I already talked about, being mainline orthodox Carlsbad or minority attack type positions, with eventually a capture on d5 taking place. Black does not want to usually capture back with the c pawns symmetrically, because the c file will usually be dominated by White, especially once this knight has been developed to d7, sort of awkwardly being needed on c6. So instead we see this move, and we have a minority attack for White, with the essential plan to be to advance the b pawn, weaken the c6 pawn as a target along the open file, and Black wanting to use his space to launch an attack on the king side. Thing to remember is that by definition, when you have a minority attack, you also have an open file. Minority often means less, right? By definition, if you have less, that means you have an open file associated with it. So 2 versus 3 is usually used as a minority attack. We often see that in open Sicilians as well. But as said, we will get to the open Sicilians individually. We really just wanted to specify the main choice between open and closed Sicilians, as we did with e4. So that handles the mainline d4, d5, QGD, and Slavs, which we have already explained in very much depth within the Yaroslav videos within this Pawn Structure 101 series. So if you want more about those, you can back up and check those out. Let's talk about the Nimzo-Indian and the other Indian defenses against d4. The Nimzo-Indian is essentially designed. Black allows white to gain space here in the center, and in the main lines of the Nimzo-Indian would like to capture on c3. The dynamics is that black has given up the bishop pair for the potential compensation of a very weak and positionally extended queenside for white. Black would like to develop with means such as, in main lines, we might see something like this, with black developing all of his pieces with the potential goal of exposing white's horribly weak queenside pawns, usually in such a way that white really doesn't have a defense for it. White, on the other hand, has the bishop pair and needs at some point to extend the center, planning to reach a pawn chain with e5, thus launching the bishops within their new goal, which is followed by the f-pawn advancing and a rook lift to create potential checkmate attacking threats against black's king. White must find compensation with a strong center in the bishop pair to justify any Nimzo-Indian where the pawns have become worse. The other mainline Nimzo-Indian, most popular these days, is the classical. Essentially here, white, it's the opposite of allowing the double pawns, but instead black is saying that I'm willing to lose time with my queen simply to avoid the positional disadvantage of the double pawns, and in doing so I've given you control over the light squares, which black will often follow up, sometimes with an immediate knight implant followed by f5, controlling these squares. Or in many mainline cases, black will play b6 and put the bishop along this diagonal first, eventually fill one of these squares, fill the square with one of those pieces, and try to follow that with f5, launching an attack on the king side. White has a potentially much better structure, and with more space, the bishop pair can eventually create devastating results in the long term for black. Essentially, that would be the basic philosophies and the basic battle here in the classical Nimzo-Indian that many players don't know. So as far as the Nimzo-Indian goes, you essentially divide it into two categories, those with the double pawns and those with the queen, wasting time in the classical and allowing black control over the central light squares. However, with the bishop pair and a much better structure, white has more potential in the long run. The King's Indian can be reached through this move order. Essentially, what black is saying in the King's Indian is I'm going to allow you to have a better, I'm going to allow you to have a better center here with your pawns, but I have two main plans in the King's Indian. The first one being one that is not played as often these days, that being the extension of the c5 pawn. So if we were just going to show it on a classical sense, after the mainline moves have been made, black's idea with c5 is essentially to launch a pawn chain toward the queen side. He will try to follow that up with a queenside breakthrough of b5, whether that's a long-term prepared idea with a relocation of the knight, rook to b8, a6, and b5, hopefully planning that the b file will become useful in conjunction with this powerful bishop on g7. Or sometimes they play this type of structure in a much more immediate sense, those who enjoy the queenside attacking play, that being in a Benko Gambit, where essentially you see the same sort of structure reached as in a King's Indian, if you notice that, except that black has sacrificed a pawn on the queen side in order to force the opening of the files here. Follow that with the development of this bishop, and you have a Benko Gambit structure. Essentially a King's Indian with an extension of c5. And we would classify the Benko Gambit in the same structure, but in an accelerated way to achieve the same goals. The Benoni is also an extended, or let's say accelerated version sometimes of a King's Indian, that being with e6. And after captures d6, in the main line Benonis, we see positions where, in this case, black has actually given up even more space in the center and potentially weakened his dark squares by trading off the e-pawn in the way that he did. However, if he does eventually get attacking chances on the queen side, black now has a majority of pawns. So unlike a Benko Gambit where black was playing for open files, here we see black is playing for much more space and a potential pawn majority, combining that with, once again, the power of the King's Indian bishop. Many players don't know that the Benoni and the Benko Gambit could be classified as, we'll say, hybrid twins or some sort of genetic variation of the King's Indian. They accelerate this idea of c5 and trying to create an imbalance for black to gain space on the queen side in the King's Indian, whereas if you chose a mainline King's Indian, you would develop in this manner and eventually play c5 down the road. We're not talking about the theoretical value of each of these, simply explaining what the pawn structures are within those positions. The other, of course, main idea and more popular idea in the King's Indian is to play for the e5 chain. Tactically, white cannot afford to grab this pawn quickly because black wins the pawn back immediately, and the simplification favors black of the pieces, as he already has access to the open d file and dark squares, in case you're wondering why the simplification favors him. And so oftentimes you will eventually see this push here. Here we have the opposite, with black trying to attack on the king side. Usually a fianchettoed setup allows for slightly more protection of your own king, which allows black to be very aggressive in the King's Indian and really go after and have some fun in terms of attacking white's king. The moves there are not the most accurate, but after we've already played the first 5, just trying to show you the structural idea. And so white, on the other hand, has more space and potentially a faster attack on the queen side. So if we were going to really evaluate the King's Indian unbiasedly and at a sort of a general beginner level, we would say that black's attack is potentially more devastating because it's attacking the king. Okay? That's what we would say, that black's attack is more devastating, potentially, let's say, a bigger prize at the end of the race. However, white's race is a little bit faster because whenever you've held more space, you're gaining immediate tension and breakthroughs against black's queen side. And again, though these are not the most theoretical accurate moves, the key breakthroughs for white in this structure would be c5 eventually, with the key plan for black being an attacking plan against white's king. The other opening that can be reached via the starting out with the King's Indian development, or the King's Indian move order, is the Grunfeld defense, with the Grunfeld being a positional sacrifice somewhat, and where black is giving up a central pawn in a way that would normally be deemed counterintuitive to give white such an early center. However, black is doing so with the intention that he's creating a pawn chain for white along the dark square diagonal that is potentially going to be undermined. You will see all of black's development from this point forward surround the ideas of increasing the pressure against this pawn chain. Black will develop the pawn, the knight, the bishop, the queen to one of these squares, and even a rook potentially to one of these squares. You may even like to see this bishop come out and if it can, try to eliminate itself for a knight. The whole idea for black in the Grunfeld is yes, I've given you the center, yes, I've given you a positional advantage, but in doing so, I've created a pawn chain that I can now target for the rest of the game. In explaining that, we were talking about black's perspective, but we've obviously explained white's perspective as well. If white can hold the center together and keep his space advantage alive, he will potentially have better pieces and usually an advantage down the road. Last thing we should mention about the Grunfeld structure is that potentially if this tension is released in white's favor, that being white-black taking it, because the capture usually helps white open up space. The only advantage that black has in the long term, if the tension breaks in this way, is a potential 2-on-1, and it's always good to be aware of that, whether you're white or black. Finally, we use something that has already been mentioned within a Nimzo move order as a discussion that will help lead us toward one knight of 3 and c4, that being a Queen's Indian. The Queen's Indian starts out as a Nimzo, but rather than allowing the dynamics of the Nimzo, as we already explained, white chooses to neglect or deny black the option to pin the knight on c3. In doing so, he's applying less protection over these critical light squares, so the main lines of the Nimzo will see black play the move b6. The main line of the Queen's Indian will see black play b6, followed by placing the bishop along this diagonal, and even an early knight infiltration of this square, followed by f5, and once again we see similar ideas that we've already discussed within a Nimzo Indian. White's plan in that type of structure generally being to undermine black's light square pawn chain once he's played f5 with the move like d5, undermining the critical middle pawn within that pawn chain and hopefully gaining space for white with ideas such as this. Transitioning, we can talk about one knight of 3, though it is not necessarily defined as any structural plan. We would say that this move order normally reaches positions such as a Catalan. A Catalan is the mainline opening that occurs like this, where black has a couple main options, either to play a closed Catalan with a move like c6, and eventually we see a closed position where, white doesn't normally play knight to c3, because if he does so, black will actually have the option of capturing and playing b5, and it can be hard for white to recoup that pawn when he's placed the bishop on this diagonal and not this diagonal. So instead, normally you see black play moves such as knight bd2. And again, in a closed Catalan, we see a structure we've already talked about, with white eventually preparing a breakthrough of e4. And if you recognize a structure you might see here in a mainline closed Catalan as a Yaroslav, then you would be on the right track and paying attention. In the open Catalan, the main lines of the Catalan, you also see, whether it's dc4 on move 4 or after bishop e7, you also see an eventual Yaroslav, because in the main lines, white will simply recapture this pawn on c4, and though these pawns have not been extended yet, once they do, we have Yaroslav principles, with white wanting to keep more space and better pieces if he's able to do so, and black trying to equalize with the moves c5 and e5. In an English move order, we might see a symmetrical English, which is always good to talk about, because though it's not as popular as mainline e4 and d4, it certainly is something that is played in tournament-level chess. And if symmetrical English is played, one main structure we can reach is a Botvinnik English, in which case white will be establishing this sort of structure here, with d3, e4, c4. Similarly to a Stonewall, this is a very, very solid structure for white. And in a Stonewall, as we have here in a Botvinnik English, white will have the potential to attack on both sides of the board, one of the main advantages of this structure. Excuse me, I'm getting a little tongue-tied toward the end here. White will have the advantages, the potential advantages on both sides of the board, it being space. So if black was to make no challenge of this sort of bind, you might see white with two plans. One being f4 and g4 and f5, using the chain to attack this way. The other being a potential idea of, for example, moving the rook over and gaining space on the queen side with plans such as b4. Black's approach against a Botvinnik English can be one of two things. It can be to play a symmetrical Botvinnik English. In many cases, white will simply maintain an edge with an extra tempo, though the positions are dynamic and interesting to play. Or black can do as I just said, sort of saying, well, the main disadvantage of your structure is you've allowed for this weak d4 outpost square. So I'm not going to play a symmetrical Botvinnik. I'm going to play this way, and though you may have the advantages that you just explained, that being you can attack on both sides of the board, potentially in the center you have a very weak outpost square on d4, and with that, potentially less space as this weak d3 pawn is backward. Black can also choose a development that involves the same sort of pawn tension, that being not playing a symmetrical, but a different move order for the knight, with knight f6. Here we see positions where black has once again maintained this pawn on e7 so that it could potentially challenge this square if needed. And again, points out that white has given black an outpost square, and black has not returned the favor. However, in this situation, by not putting another pawn in the center, he's definitely allowing for white to gain a space advantage. Black can often play this line with the intention of relocating this knight around here, and with two plans. One coming to e6 and d4, fully exposing the outpost square, and the other being to move rook to b8, a6, and b5. Finally, the other structure you can have in English, rather than a Botvinnik, would be to simply maintain the similar sort of structures that we just explained for black. Rather than advancing the c4 pawn, you leave it back, whether it be on e3 or e2, thus keeping the bishop on g2 open, and planning normally for space and plans to gain squares for your pieces and gain space and attacking chances on the queen side. The last type of pawn structure we'd like to talk about here is one that can potentially be reached through Englishes, through 1d4, and even 1e4, that being a Maroczy bind. In these cases, if we started with a Maroczy bind via this move order, for example, in situations where black has been able to fiend kettle this bishop, and white has chosen not to extend d4 until after black has played the move c5. In many of these positions, the type of Maroczy bind that is reached is sort of a hedgehog, with positions like this suggesting that black has less space, though these pawns do control many different critical squares. White has more space in a Maroczy bind type structure, which is defined as these e4 and c4 moves. Black usually eventually tries to prepare a breakthrough with d5, as well as put potential pressure against the c4 pawn, as by definition in all Maroczy binds, the c file is usually open. Again, the move order there may not have been the most accurate, but the point is to highlight a Maroczy bind against a hedgehog, with the last one being a Maroczy bind against a dragon. The difference in structure being that though there is still an open C file for black, and then we still have the same type of structures here, rather than seeing the light squared bishop fianchettoed here with black having pawns on E6 and D6. Instead, we see a more solid kingside for black with a dragon development of the bishop, or a King's Indian development of the bishop, and slightly less space in terms of the center. Usually for white, in the dragon type of Maroczy binds, white has one major plan, which is a Marco hop idea, to put a knight on D5, capture back with the E pawn, and open the E file to attack the E7 pawn. Black's ideas would be similar to one I already laid out, though it would not be to play for D5 as it is in a hedgehog, as in the last Maroczy bind example. Here, black's idea would be mainly to put pressure against the C4 pawn exposed along the C file. Okay, well, I really hope you enjoyed that video. That will be a staple feature here on the Chess.com website, something that players can refer back to whenever they need that sort of definitive description of every mainline opening. Can you believe it that we just ran through about 40 mainline openings in about 40 minutes? I'm super proud of myself. You should be super proud of yourself. Go get yourself a snack. Get yourself a treat. Treat yourself right tonight. Do me a favor and do that, okay? Love you guys, and I will see you around here on Chess.com.